We take a deep breath. And we come into this beautiful moment. Thank you for all the YouTubers joining in. And for those of you here present with us today, present time. And so we're going to be we're actually starting the teachings over because we already finished going through the nine tenets. And so we're going to start with, in living peace, we're going to start with talking about the 3 aspects of ego and then the 5 layers of consciousness, because those 2 teachings are really fantastic when we actually get into mastery of thought next week, then mastery of impulse, mastery of emotion, etc., etc. Who's heard of ego before? Just raise your hands. But there's so many different understandings of ego. A lot of times people just understand it as just being arrogant or narcissistic, but we don't realize that it also is when you're stuck in self-pity, you're also trapped in ego. So ego is not only just self-inflation, it is also self-belittlement. Who's ever judged yourself? That's your ego speaking. It's the aspect of ourselves that feels separate, that feels somehow disworthy or over superior, and it's just creating this division within yourself and within other people. And fortunately, I've created this cool little teaching of the 3 aspects of ego that really breaks it down into deeper understandings. And so if you have something you want to take notes on, you're welcome to write on it, or if you just want to follow along, I do have it listed here in the pamphlet. But the 3 aspects of ego is pushing. So it's the push, the pull, and the hold tight. Pushing is the frustration of resisting things we don't like. Pulling is the neurotic grasping for things that we do like. And holding tight is the fear of change and letting things go. All 3 deny present reality and cause suffering. So who's ever pushed against something in your life that you don't like? Does it cause you peace or suffering? It can create physical pain, it can create mental pain, emotional pain. There's just something that you're looking at and you don't like, either within yourself or within someone else or the collective world, and you're just like, I don't like that. Just those statements right there, you can write this down, I don't like. Saying that out loud actually leads to some little bit of tightening in your chest, rather than simply saying, I accept that. Because you don't necessarily have to like or dislike it, but you can accept that it's a present reality and it is what it is. And when you're in acceptance of the isness of that isness, all of a sudden you start to return to peace a little bit more. And then you have the grasping. Who likes things? Who has interests and desires? Hopefully most of you, or all of you. It's okay if you don't. But if you have likes and desires, you're going to notice that sometimes you get a little neurotic about them. Ever been on a first date before and you really hope it went somewhere after that? No? And then in modern times, you're like checking your phone and the text, did he text me back? Did he text me back? And you get a little cuckoo. It's more of the newer generations coming out. But even back then, it was waiting for that phone call. I remember my mom would tell me stories where she's like, get off the phone, I'm waiting for my now husband, my now father to call. And so it's just so funny that anytime we get attached to someone or something that we really like, it can actually cause us suffering. It can cause us suffering. And then we go down this road of desire, and this can also go into addiction, because pretty much anything can be addiction. Anything that takes that edge off of your stress and you really enjoy it and it helps bring some relief in that moment. And then even after the pain is away, you find that it makes you feel good and just keep going back to it, because you like it. It's funny how those things that you're liking, that creates a little bit of release, actually can lead to further pain, because you're not actually dealing with the present reality at hand. Whew. So we see that our likes cause us suffering and our dislikes cause us suffering. Well, what the hell else is out there? Well, we'll get into that. And then the third one is holding tight. Who's been afraid to let shit go? Or who's been afraid to let even abuse go? Because at least a shitty relationship is better than being alone. Who's been there? I see some nods. I think most of us have probably been there at some point or another, that we remain in a job that we really do not prefer. We remain in a relationship that we do not even prefer. And then all we're doing with our friends and our family are bitching about it. But then if we get fired, we're like, well, how dare they? Even though that's the perfect manifestation of what we've been asking for long. Or maybe that abusive relationship, they actually say goodbye to us. You're like, well, you're not allowed to leave me. I'm supposed to leave you. And then it pulls you back in. And you go down that merry-go-round again and again and again. Or maybe you don't even get to that point because we're just so afraid to let go. At least I always view it as a house of cards that you're just holding together. And when you're holding that house of cards together, your body's constantly tense because you're afraid of just one piece falling off. What's so wrong about things falling apart? That's my question to you. No, absolutely nothing. And you'll learn later on in the teachings that we share, there is no right or wrong, good or bad. It just is what it is. The morality and the judgment we have actually leads to further guilt, further shame, and it just really messes us up, keeps us in abuse, keeps us in addiction even longer when we're judging ourselves. So, have you ever heard the saying, when sometimes you need things to fall apart so that they can then later fall into place? But we forget about that, don't we? Sometimes we need things to fall apart so that they can then fall into place. And so if you're constantly holding things together, so afraid to let shitty things go to the wayside because you can't handle being alone or maybe not having that sense of security in a job for a short while, it actually is it's hard to fill a cup that's already full, right? So it's actually keeping the things that you don't want in your life because you can't handle that gap period of allowing that to fall to the wayside and then allowing new things to come in. And that causes a lot of suffering. I'll tell you what, that causes a lot of suffering. So we have the push, resistance, we have the pull, the grasping, the precious, that type of grasping. We've all been there. And then we have the holding tight. Those are the three aspects of ego. So if you ever find yourself in resistance and judging things, you know that you are in the push. Whenever you find yourself being neurotic about something that you really like and you really desire, and you can't stop thinking about it because you just want it to come true, and then you just like, oh my gosh, you keep thinking about it. Hope can fuck you up. Just put it out there. Hope can fuck you up. Because who's been disappointed after you were hopeful? The pendulum swings. You were hoping you'd get that job. You'd hope you'd hear back from that relationship. You'd hope things would just fall through. Maybe you're planning this big event and then 2 people showed up. That's happening. Anyway, moving forward. So the hope can lead to that, and that's the grasping for external things. That's grasping for external validation of your well-being. And then, of course, we have the hold tight, not letting things that are long past their expiration date, just being able to let them go. Does that make sense? So we breathe in peace, and we exhale love. So I'm actually going to go ahead and read a little bit because in my book, Plug for Living Peace, you can find it on Amazon. I actually have the reverse aspects of each of them. So I talk about the issue of each, and then I have the reverse aspects of them and what we can do instead. So I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But so reverse push is called calm acceptance. Anger and judgmental attitudes stem from the hard and fast opinions about things that we may deem wrong or bad. We see something we don't like, and we're ready to go to war with it. War stands for W-A-R, we are right. However, 99% of the time, we don't need to have an opinion about what's going on outside of ourselves or in anyone else's life. Instead, we can just accept people and situations as they are. When you learn to bring further acceptance into your life, so maybe you have that friend or that relative that you just cannot get along with because they're judging you up the wall and you're just like, they don't like my life choices. It's okay if they don't like your life choices. You don't need to have an opinion about their opinion on your life because it's your opinion about their opinion on your life that is causing you pain. But if you let that go, it's so liberating. It is so liberating. I've told this story before. I'm going to tell it again because it's going to be new to a few of you. But there's the monk that lived many long ages ago. There was a monk that lived with a village, and he was just above it slightly, and he and the villagers had a fantastic, beautiful, co-creative relationship. Looking back, it might have been more codependent on the villagers to him. But anyway, a beautiful co-creative relationship. And he would help them and give them medicine and all these things. And they'd come to him for spiritual counsel. And it was just this beautiful relationship. Well, once upon a time, there's this woman in the villager. She was probably around 16, 17, 18, got pregnant. And then she blamed the monk. because she didn't want her boyfriend at the time out of wedlock. He'd be kicked out of the village. And so she didn't want her boyfriend to get kicked out of the village because she loved him. Well, she's just like, well, they can't kick the monk out, so let's blame the monk. And so the villagers all come up to the door and they knock and say, how dare you? You betrayed our trust. You're not a real monk. Just saying all these things, calling him a hypocrite. And all he said in response was, is that so? All he said in response to them accusing him of pregnating that woman in the village was, is that so? He did not care about their opinion of him, and he kept doing his peace practice nonetheless. Well, 9 months go later, she gives birth, and they bring the baby to him, and she says, this is your problem now. And he takes the baby and looks at it and says, is that so? And he raises the kid as if it is his own. Beautiful thing. Not a second, not a word of defense, not trying to go there. He just says, is that so? Well, a while later, the woman, she just can't handle the guilt anymore, so she comes clean. And then all the villagers come up and just like, oh, we're so sorry. They bring him gifts and all these things. They're just like, they're prostrating in front of him and just saying, we are so sorry, please forgive our ignorance. And of course, all he said was, is that so? And I love this Zen story because it shows that it doesn't matter what's happening outside of yourself. It doesn't matter the different opinions that other people are having on your life. What matters is your peace practice. What matters is your own connection. If you're religious, your own connection with God. It doesn't matter how it's going to manifest for you. But are you using other people and their opinions or the world and the chaos as a whole as an excuse to be a neurotic basket case? Are you using other situations as your excuse to not be in alignment, aka the neurotic basket case? I've been there. Does that make sense? How many of you use other people as an excuse to not practice, to not be in your peace, and just say, well, I had this awful day and I just need to have a few beers or whatever. And then you go into that direction. And when you're doing that direction, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going in that direction, you're probably not leaning into the discomfort of it and practicing your peace practices. Instead, you're just looking to take the edge off rather than fully leaning into it. Does that make sense? Rather than having that difficult conversation with that person that you've been putting off for a while.
How do you execute change with that thought?
Oh, here's the question. How do you execute change with this awareness, with that thought? What's fun is that as long as you keep doing your own peace practice, you keep focusing on acceptance, you can no longer deny the reality at hand. Because what often keeps us trapped and suffering is our denial of the reality. We keep recycling the same shit different day, But when you actually accept the chaos for the chaos, or you accept the abusive situation, you accept the job that you hate for the job that you hate, you're going to much more quickly make changes to it rather than constantly sweeping it under the rug, often with subtle or hard addictions that kind of just take the edge off, or distractions may even be. Who just watches TV at the end of the day and because you don't want to think about the hard day that you had. And so what happens is when we fully step into acceptance rather than pushing these things away, we are so much more prone to take action. And then another situation, let me think real quick. Because we can talk about political change or maybe like the global change that we made, that's also an issue that arises. Well, when you're coming from a place of acceptance and thus peace, it's going to completely change the way in which you show up in trying to help other people. A lot of people are motivated by the frustrations that they see on the planet. And then that leads them into anger, and it leads them into very rash decisions. And what ends up happening with that is often it creates further division between religious and political and cultural alliance rather than actually bridging communication channels. Because if you're yelling at someone that they're wrong, doesn't change opinion. But when you're actually at peace within yourself and you just open these dialogue channels, it really does start to transform things. And so it's different than what we're used to, because a lot of times it's like you need to be hot and bothered to create change in your life or in other people's lives. But really, it's important to have that inner peace, because if you're hot and bothered, which I'm actually going to read real quick. Let me see real quick. This is about, I can just tell you it. I'm not going to get it perfect, but hard emotion, heavy emotion, like anger, you're just a donkey. And you have that stick with the carrot. And anywhere someone points that stick, you're going to follow it. So when you're angry and someone says that's the problem, you're going to follow it towards the problem. But when you actually have inner peace, you're not the donkey. Well, maybe you're a donkey. You're a free-range donkey. You no longer have that stick attached to the carrot at the end, and you actually fully think for yourself and not get caught up in the emotional bias of what's really triggering you. Does that make sense?
The word accept.
Yeah.
And that could be how I'm looking at that word.
Mm-hmm.
I want to replace it with aware.
Yeah, that would work. That would work. And so for those listening at home, possibly changing the word acceptance to awareness. But I'm going to challenge you slightly because that's why we're here. Yeah.
To accept something.
Yeah.
I've got that thing that if I accept it, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
And that may be my background, my bringing up, my schooling.
Yeah.
I need a different word.
Yeah. And I would definitely say awareness can be perfect for now for you. But if you keep coming here and you read the book and do all these things, you are slowly going to recondition that word, because acceptance does not mean condoning something. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily agreeing with it. It just means that you're accepting that this is the fact of the matter. And once I can fully accept that this is a fact of the matter, then I can actually take steps to transform it, whether it's something that's causing pain or whether it's something that's causing peace. But yeah, that absolutely does make sense, the direction that you're going with that in. And that's actually a question I get quite often. So you're in good company.
I get what you're saying, but
yeah.
When I think of things,
yeah,
if I accept it, I feel like I'm going along with it.
Yeah.
I've got to have a different word for it.
So for now, I would say just use the awareness then. Yeah, absolutely. Let's breathe that in. And so we move on to reverse pull. Reverse pull. We all hear stories of people chasing their dreams and achieving their happy endings. However, we're rarely told that it's not really a happily ever after. Anyone reach your happily ever after? Yes, I'm happy to hear that. Sure, they may have reached their goal or personal landmark, but getting what they want has nothing to do with actual happiness or life satisfaction. What immediately happens is that another goal is set, and then another, and then another. The chase never ends because the ego always wants more. That is what often occurs, especially here in the Western mindset. More, more, more. Better, bigger, more. But what's fascinating is it's actually acceptance that actually leads to contentment and peace in the happily ever after. But what happens for most of us is that we don't have that self-acceptance. We don't have that acceptance or the contentment around us. And we're always wanting that next juicy thing. A little bit more money, or a little bit more prestige, or a little bit more comfort, a little bit more love. I would say this is a common one. Who could like a little more appreciation from the people in your life? And so we're always wanting just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Even if we eat the best meal of our lives, shortly thereafter, we will be hungry again. Even if we begin making more money that we dream possible, we still have to manage it properly and then worry about maintaining the lifestyle having it entails. Even if we have our dream wedding and create our dream family, we will incessantly worry about everyone's health and well-being because death and loss of those we love is inevitable. We will always be chasing some new idea, some greater feelings, some further goals, some ultimate peace, unless we let go of thinking we need pleasure, need to feel secure, and need to feel love to be happy. When we have pleasure, security, and love, we can have pleasure, security, and love, but these three things, if we are attached to them and fear losing them, will forever keep a gnawing goblin camped out in the back of our mind. Let's breathe that in. I love this teaching because it's so true. You know, it's like, I just want to go for this nice hike. I have all this built up energy. I just want to go for this nice hike. So I go into the mountains or wherever, and I just start hiking, and I get tired. And the last thing I want to be doing in that moment is hiking. I just want to get home and take a nice bath. And so I get home and I take a nice bath. And then it's just like, that's all I really want in that moment. But then I get soggy and pruny. And all I want to do is just get out of that damn bath and get dry. And then I'm really hungry. And all I want is that pizza, that full giant vegan pizza. But then I eat too much. And then I regret my decision of eating too much. And all I want is just not to be so full. And so in Buddhism, they often teach about moderation. Because a lot of the times, the things that you want or the things that you crave are going to actually eventually be the thing that you don't want or crave. But then it recycles back around because you're going to be hungry again, and then you're going to want to exercise again, or then you're going to want to take the edge off again. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always that next thing. And as long as you're aware of it, you don't need to be trapped by that mindset. Constantly being on like a circular treadmill, just jumping from thing to thing to thing to thing. So let's breathe that in. And so I'll just make the last one pretty quick because we covered these pretty juicily. Accepting and releasing our need to hold on to anything, be it relationships, physical items, reputations, outdated beliefs, ideas, or even jobs and the roles we play in life is the ultimate freedom. Now, this doesn't mean we release every obligation and throw caution to the wind. It just means we stop trying to control and manipulate in an attempt to hold something together or keep someone in our lives that is clearly not for us. When we're holding tight, a lot of times that leads to manipulation. So if you ever find yourself trying to manipulate a situation, you may not view it as manipulation, but I love that word because generally we don't want to be seen as a manipulative insert word. But it happens. It happens. When we're in fear, we will subtly manipulate the people around us to get what we want, be it validation, be it security, be it love, be it affection, be it appreciation. We just subtly try to manipulate things. But in actuality, if you look back on the hindsight of every situation or job or work relationship or friendship that you tried holding on to, but then it didn't work out and the vase broke, but you kept trying to put it back together, probably in hindsight, you now realize that it was always meant to break and there's nothing to fix. Really hear that. When a vase breaks, it's okay. It's okay when a vase breaks. You don't need to put it back together. Sometimes there is so much wisdom in things falling apart. But we often hold it so tight that we don't allow things to fall apart, or we may not allow ourselves to fall apart. But the truth is, many of you who've hit rock bottom before, doesn't it lead to awakening? Doesn't it lead to these amazing self-realizations? So why are we so afraid of things going, quote, bad or wrong, when in actuality, that might be the thing that wakes us up? Pretty cool, huh? So let's breathe that in. So I'm going to check the time real quick. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to do this fairly briefly. Let's go into the 5 layers of consciousness real quick. So in my book, I came up with the 5 layers of consciousness just because it's there to help you, but you don't have to fully go along with it if you don't want to. That's okay. But it just really helps compartmentalize things and why you might have, two very religious pastors teaching about the same section from the Bible, but they're coming at it from completely different angles, and this is why. So the first layer of consciousness is the mundane. There is no awareness of ego, duality, or attachment. The second one is the collective. We awaken to our attachments, and we start to become more selfless, but we're still dualistic. These two, I would say, probably about 90% of the planet exist within. Again, that's an assumption, but just based off of observations. So when we're in the mundane, all we're just wrapped up into is our own personal life. We really are not thinking about the greater whole. And maybe there's just too much going on where we really can't think about the greater whole. That doesn't mean people can't be happy in this, but generally their happiness is based on things going right. External situations that are flowing really well for them. And then when shit hits the fan, it's like, oh God. And then you start to awaken into collective and realize, wow, I can cultivate empathy and the world does not revolve around me and my family. And you start caring about the world, and you may join a political group or a religious group, and you start to join communities, and that's where religious and political groups are born, in the collective, where people come together and they say, we have the answer. We have the answer. And unfortunately, there's a selflessness, because you may have met very judgmental people in political or religious groups, but they're selfless and they really give of themselves. But if you're not part of their group, you might as well not exist. And unfortunately, that is not very unifying on the planet, but that just shows that there's the mundane and then there's collective. But guess what happens when you're the black sheep of that community, or the rainbow sheep? You get thrown out, and you realize that you start to realize the gold plating starting to flake off. And you realize if you're not agreeing with these certain dogmatic beliefs, then you don't belong there anymore. And a lot of times there in the collective is what happens is there's a right and a wrong and a good and a bad. There's a right way to live and there's a good way to live, and then there's a bad way to live and there's a wrong way to live, often using the word of sin. And there's a lot of schism. But when you realize that maybe you're the sinner or the sinful one in that situation, you start to wake up and you realize all of this is egotistical. All this is dualistic. And then you get to fall into the transcendent layer of consciousness. And in the transcendent layer of consciousness, you start to realize that all these things that you once believed to be true aren't necessarily true. They're just opinions of other people. And those opinions are often leading to further pain, or they're leading to peace. And so transcendent awakens our ego, awakens to the aspect of ego. And so I like to say that we're aware, but we're still neurotic. Because who's aware of like the contrasts on the planet, and you just wish there was more compassion and all these things, and you just want to give love, but then you break down and then it's just sometimes hard. And so you have that pendulum swing going. Can't we just all get along? That was me for many years. And then you eventually get into the galactic and you awaken to the understanding of duality. And so you actually start to have some peace in your life. You realize that even though there's this contrast and the duality and there's just all these things going on, at the end of the day, we never can get it wrong and we never finish. So all this uphill battle and this uphill climb that we're going for, all this judgment, all this separation, it's all for naught. And a lot of times people in the transcendent are actually still very judgmental towards maybe the religion that they came from, or the political group that they came from, or the culture that they came from, or the family that they came from. And so we're still in that moment of we're judging things that we don't like. There's that resistance there. Once you get into the galactic, there's really no longer any resistance. And this is what a lot of the masters and the sages over the centuries, the mystics, have taught us. That when you fully come into that state of acceptance, you realize that really no matter what you do or what you don't do, life still goes on, with or without you. And sure, we're getting to a point where it's like we literally could fuck up the planet and blow it up if we wanted to. So that's great. A little bit different than 2,500 years ago when some of these teachings were born. But at the same time, when you're in the galactic, going back to what we previously said, we're no longer trying to change the planet from a place of anger. We're trying to build bridges of communication based on a place of peace. Because something that transcends all cultures, religions, politics, whatever you're at, really at the end of the day, we just want to be well. And we just get attached to different ideas of how we think we're going to be well. And sometimes those ideas actually lead to further harm for ourselves or others. But if we can see that compassion and look beyond it, look beyond people's labels, and just see that there's an individual suffering there and that they're in pain, it's a beautiful thing that can be remedied. One of my favorite examples of this was a couple years ago during one of the rallies, during one of the presidential rallies. There was a big group of neo-Nazis, and they were just chanting these very racial things. And then there was this Jewish woman, just this very old, frail, very liberal Jewish woman that was like filming it. And she was just trying to ask questions and understand and get to know the group. And then something accidentally happened and she got hit and her head was bleeding. And then these two huge, like tatted up neo-Nazi shaved head guys came to her rescue and just said, "Are you okay?" And that just made me tear up, because it's like we get into these ideas and we feel powerful and we get our adrenaline pumping. But then when this woman actually really needed help, they put that to the wayside and was there for her and helped her up. And she actually got to know them and became their friends. And then communication happened. Isn't that interesting? And so we get so caught up in our mindset of what is wrong, what is bad, that we forget sometimes that every single person deserves human decency. And a lot of times these labels keep us from reaching that point. And in the galactic consciousness, that's a completely non-issue. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? And that's what we're all learning to work on here together, no matter what end of the spectrum is. Because in our community, we have people on all ends of the spectrum, all different religions. And that's why it's so juicy and beautiful, because we're all coming here to learn more about how to achieve inner peace. Does that make sense? Let's breathe that in. Oh, So that was just a quick overview of the 3 aspects of ego: push, pull, and hold tight, and then the 5 layers of consciousness. Really, I could spend 20 minutes just on the 5 layers of consciousness, but I hope that gives you a little bit of grasp. Maybe we'll cover it a little bit more next week as we go into mastery of thought. We'll see. But one thing I really want you to understand is that the 5 layers of consciousness, we constantly go in and out of them throughout the day. We're not just at one. And so if you find yourself really becoming judgmental, you can say, oh, right now I'm in this layer. And I can now look at it and say, I want to move up the scale and go into this layer. And I can do that by having a greater sense of acceptance for myself and other people. And going back to what I initially said, the reason why you might have 2 pastors preaching completely different things from the Bible is that if you have a pastor in the mundane or collective, they're going to be viewing the very dualistic teachings of the Bible and using it to separate. But if you have a pastor that's in the transcendent or the galactic, they're just going to view it all as metaphors and use it as learning opportunities to help bridge that gap and just really focus on compassion for all beings, and that everyone is in God's love and grace. And you actually see pastors on 2 ends of the spectrum. It's very fascinating. They're all preaching the same thing, but they're preaching it from a completely different layer of consciousness. And that's how that happens. That's the why.
Isn't that all different religions? Isn't that the definition of
absolutely
religions?
Absolutely. All the different religions, you're going to see different people in different layers preaching it from different angles, just as we preach this type of stuff in a completely different angle. And it goes into different political groups. It goes into the culture. It goes into absolutely everything that you do, everything that we say. But it's so cool to have examples of that and see it very clearly. And you're just like, this doesn't make sense because there's just so much schism there. Well, if you look at the degree of consciousness and the level of consciousness that we're existing in, then it makes sense. When you're caught up in an emotional argument with someone in your life and you're just so angry, you're in the mundane or the collective. But when you take some time out and you separate from the situation, you say, let me just focus on myself. Let me raise up my vibration, which expands my consciousness. Then you go back to it. All of a sudden, there's a different solution. You couldn't find the solution previously because you were so emotionally charged by it. But when you actually take some space and you return to your peace and you come back to that conversation, boom, new layer of consciousness. You're actually able to maintain that equilibrium and build that bridge. Isn't that juicy? So let's breathe that in. And we release. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Juicy talk today. I hope you all get to join us next week for the Mastery of Thought. For all you YouTubers, thank you, thank you, thank you. Links are down below for our website, Patreon page, and if you ever feel inclined to donate. Thank you and blessed be.